Um, as I said, we're finishing up the series we've been doing in Exodus, starting in Exodus 20 in the Ten Commandments, God's 10 words for the people of Israel. The idea that this is the, the people that you need to be under this covenant. This is the way that God wants us to live. This is who God wants us to be. And we've made it all the way to the end of this session. And I wanted to spend just a real brief moment, just kind of refreshing our memory on a couple of little things just to bring up what we've been talking about. Because if you remember, we talked about the fact that while we are not under the Ten Commandments today, we're not under the law of Moses today, we are given a foundation of who we are to be that didn't get instituted at Mount Sinai. This is, with the exception of the command to remember the Sabbath, these are things that had been in place long before. From the very beginning, this is who God wanted us to be. And as we talked about this throughout the series, as we go into each one of these and we look at them, we start to see how each one of these is a very simple command on the face of it, but at the same time, we see how much of a deeper application there really is. We start to see how each of these really point us towards how we can honor God in our hearts or reflect God in our own lives. And we talked about each of these commandments, like all of God's commandments. These are things that were given to us for our good always, as Moses told the people. They were never intended to hold us back or limit us somehow, but they were intended to be a blessing for our lives. That if we would truly embrace what God has called us to do, we will live good lives, fulfilling lives, lives that are characterized by love, by peace, and by joy. As we look at this last command, I want to show you something. I've been thinking about this a little bit as we've gone, and I think I may have even alluded to it at one point. But there's an interesting pattern that develops maybe as you start to notice these things. And I'll grant you that one of these is going to be a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me on this. Because when you look at, for example, Commandment 4 and 5, I've talked about how a lot of times you'll see in the Bible sections that are structured in a way from the outside into the middle, and how they kind of show us some things and make some comparisons like this in this kind of structure. And when we think about this, these fourth and fifth command, or fifth and sixth commandments, the very middle ones, we see a commonality there. They're about valuing life and the life giver. We see that whether it's about our parents, whether it's about God, there's a commonality there. And if we jump back one more to the next one, we start looking at remembering the Sabbath and committing adultery. Well, that doesn't seem like comparable things at all, but they're both about covenants, aren't they? Honoring Israel's covenant, that was what the Sabbath was supposed to be. It was something that was a covenant between God and Israel. That's why we don't observe it today. But this idea that you're going to honor divine covenants because God has given them to you. And when you look back one more, this is probably the one that's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's still there. This idea of not misusing God's name, as we talked about, or not stealing. Again, that doesn't seem related on the surface, but both of these are about respecting God's blessings, whether it be the name that God has given us. This is, the idea of honoring the name of God, as we talked about. This isn't just about saying bad words. It's about speaking about God and using God's name and wearing God's name in a way that reflects the fact that God has shared his covenant name with us. We are in a relationship with him, and we ought not to be using that name in a way that brings dishonor to God. And by the same idea, when we steal, what are we doing? We're taking the blessings of God that have been given to somebody else and commandeering them for our own uses. We ought not to do that. This is the idea of respecting God's blessings. Then we bump this out one more, and we see the idea of graven images and the idea of false witnesses. And well, how are those related? Well, they're related because they're about truth, aren't they? Bearing graven images, the idea that don't create a false image of God. Don't create an image that limits God and shows him in a way that he was never intended to be seen. Speak the truth about God. I can't speak the truth about God if I create a metal image of him that limits who he is. And by the same token, obviously, whenever we speak, whether it's about our neighbors, about ourselves, we're going to speak truth about whatever we're given, whatever we speak. And that brings us to the last one. And frankly, this is probably the most obvious, though, which is the idea of recognizing God's preeminence, whether it be no other gods before me, putting God's first. Isn't that what that's about? The idea of preferring God above all things. I don't put anything else above God. And I think that helps us to understand a little bit what we mean when we say do not covet. Because ultimately, that's really what covetousness really is, isn't it? It's about me putting something above God, or it's about valuing something that God has given me above Him. Really, what are we doing there? We're putting the creation above the Creator. Does that sound like idolatry? That's pretty similar to that, isn't it? And if you'll notice in Exodus 20, which we will read in verse 17, we get the first elaboration on this command that we received since we talked about honoring your father and mother. He goes into detail in verse 17. He says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor." Now, why does he do that? I don't think this is just a random list of possessions here. Don't covet his house. In other words, where he dwells, his home, where he lives, his wife, the partner God has given him to share his life and fulfill his sexual needs. It's his and his alone. Don't covet it. His servants, the extent of his household. If you had a lot of servants, you probably had a pretty big house. And you had probably a lot of money. You had a lavish lifestyle. You don't covet that. His ox, his ability to do work, his resources, his business, his income, the abundance of the food that he was able to harvest because he has a good ox and I don't. Don't covet that. His donkey, his ability to bear burdens easily. Think about, this guy doesn't have to carry anything. He's got a donkey to carry it all. He just walks down the road and I'm wearing this pack behind me. Don't covet that. Or anything, he says. Basically, anything that's left out. This isn't a situation where I'm going to look at this list and go, well, okay, I can covet this part. No. Whatever he has, you don't covet. Just don't covet anything. And if we think about this, in connection of how we view God and everything else that we've seen throughout this series. What is covetousness other than a desire for something that God has given someone else that causes me to no longer be content with what God has given me? And my focus now shifts from glorifying God to envying my brother. And when that happens, well, what typically happens? Right? What typically follows that? Well, my energy now shifts from emulating God to emulating or even competing with my brother. My focus is now shifted away. Inevitably, what are we doing? We're no longer serving the master who purchased us. We're serving our own appetites. All of a sudden, we're no longer trusting in God to provide, and we're no longer satisfied with what he has promised to provide, and we're no longer focused on doing God's will because we're now focused on what we can get for ourselves, depending on our own ingenuity and our own industry to do that. It's not hard to see, is it, how this could lead us away from God? Which is probably why Jesus spends so much time in his ministry talking about the dangers of desiring material possessions, particularly in the book of Luke. When you read the book of Luke, that's one of his primary themes. But when we talk about this idea in the Sermon on the Mount and what kind of a Christian you're going to be and the nature of the kingdom, he tells us in Matthew 6:19, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And he makes the important connection, I think, in verse 24, which is kind of what we alluded to just earlier. No one can serve two masters, he says. For either you'll hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And of course, the word money, mammon, it's a vague translation there, and most people translate it money, but there's probably different ways that you could think about this. And he could just have easily said possessions, status, or anything else in this life that we so often will covet. Because what happens if that's what we're serving, it's going to drive our actions, it motivates the way we live and the choices that we make. Jesus says you can't serve the Lord when that's your emphasis. And that's what Paul's talking about in Colossians 3:5, when he tells us to put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Sinful covetousness, inordinate desire. That's the enemy of our faith. Because what does it do? It places things above the one who gave us those things, right? It places earthly gain above spiritual growth. It places pursuing what you don't have above the stewardship of what you have already been given. And ultimately, covetousness changes the way we see ourselves and the way that we want to be seen by others. We're called to be defined by our faith, aren't we? But how's the world like to define us? The world wants to define people by our things: car we drive, house we live in, the clothes we wear, the status we obtain, all of those things. Now, status obviously isn't a thing per se, but it's something that we covet. It's something that we want. In fact, in many cases, it's the thing that we covet the most. We want people to see us in a certain way. And wasn't that one of the biggest problems when Jesus came? John 12 talks about this when he says that the Jews in many cases believed who Jesus was. But in verse 42 of John 12, he says, nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, so they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. That's a form of idolatry. Isn't that exactly what Paul's talking about? When we care more about the praises of other people than we do about the approval of God. Covetousness, I knew I was going to have a hard time saying that word. Covetousness always involves replacing God with something else. Even if it's just in that moment, in that particular point in time, attaining this thing, achieving this honor, amassing this level of wealth becomes more important to me than giving honor and glory to God. And maybe that's the best way to think about what it means to covet something. And what makes this sin more dangerous, I think, than any of the other sins we've mentioned, is that it flows so naturally from the blessings that God has already given us. We are created, if you think about this, with a drive to achieve, to excel, to earn. I will tell you this. I remember when I was at Campbell Road, I would look around me and think, man, these are people that are my age, and these dudes are CEOs and VPs, and they've done really, really well in their life. Like, what did I miss? I missed something here. But the idea is, we see Christians that have achieved great things in this life. And a big part of that is because God has given us a desire to work and to excel and to do good work. And when we're following that divine example, we're going to have some success. And so there are a lot of our brethren that have done very well. How easy is it as we do that to start valuing the blessings over the one who is blessing us, and to start mixing up the source of those blessings, right? I'm more convinced that I'm convinced that when we do that, those blessings start to decrease in value, which seems counterintuitive to us. We put more emphasis on a thing and it becomes less valuable. That doesn't make any sense, does it? But I think there's a sense in which that's true. And I think we can see this in some pretty simple applications. When someone you truly love gives you a gift, why do you treasure it? Why do you keep it on display in the house? Take extra care to not to damage it or to lose it. It has to do purely with who it came from. It's not about the gift. It's not about the thing. You can get plenty of those. It's about that this was given me from someone who cared about me and who loved me and did this for me. When we stop realizing that and appreciating that this is the source of the blessing that we have in this world, from an almighty creator of the universe who cares for us and wants us to have good lives, that ought to fill us with gratitude, doesn't it? With joy, and give us even more appreciation for what we have in this life and what we've been given. If you look at this world today and our culture, particularly in this country, we are the wealthiest nation in the history of this world, despite what anybody wants to tell you in the media. It's not close. We have the opportunity to eat food every day. We're going to go eat lunch. I don't know where we're eating, but I guarantee you it will be something that people in the history of this world would have said only kings can eat like that. And yet we eat it every day. And we live in a way that the majority of the people that lived on this planet, this history, would be astounded at. We live in homes, we drive cars, our houses are filled with possessions that in some cases we just got them because we could. Didn't need it, but I just liked it. And I had some extra money, so all right, I'll just buy it. We just buy things. In many cases, we don't really need them. But do we seem to be content in this world? Anybody look particularly content to you when we look around? Do we seem happy? We have more than ever we've ever had in this history. And yet more and more, what are we focused on? We're focused on what we don't have. Usually because we see somebody else that has it. And now I want it because he doesn't have it. Because I don't have it, he has it. And why shouldn't I have that? Isn't that kind of how we're kind of ingrained to live in this life? We live in a world that frankly ought to point us back to Ecclesiastes, because every time I think about our culture and the state of this world, I'm reminded of what he said over and over again. Solomon emphasizes this idea in Ecclesiastes 5:10, who says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them in his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of the laborer when he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep." Why? Because now it's about collecting the things. And when it becomes about collecting the things, I see all the things that I don't have. And I need to go get those. And sometimes it doesn't even stop there. I saw this on social media last week, and it just really embodied it. There's a guy named Andrew Tate. You may not have heard of him. If you're not on Twitter, you probably haven't. But if you are, you know him very well. He's a kickboxer he used to be a kickboxer. Anyway, he made a lot of money. He's now very famous for his social media presence, and he's constantly bragging about his prowess, his money. He sets himself as a role model for success, particularly for men. He posted this a few days ago. I just happened to see it, and I was like, this is just perfect because I'm talking about this. If you can't read this is what he said. The worst thing about becoming rich, and he points out how much money he has, because that's important, is that there's nothing to buy. You invest to increase your money, but that's not buying things. 20 cars, 10 houses, yacht, jet, 15 diamond watches, done. Then you're left with piles of money and nothing at all to buy besides steak. Now, he meant that as a boast. That's not intended to be a negative thing. But do we see that? How empty does that sound? That sound like someone whose money has made him happy? I suspect, none of us are ever going to reach this point in our lives where I got so much money, I've run out of things to buy. I've literally bought everything that is possible to buy. I bought it. But do you see the irony there? When I have so much money that it literally loses its value. It's worth nothing to me. Isn't that amazing? It can never satisfy. It's never enough. It will always leave us wanting something that it cannot give us. And that's the point that Solomon makes, isn't it? In Ecclesiastes 6:7, all the toil of man is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is never satisfied. That's the part of what Jesus means in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13:22. We talked about the deceitfulness of riches. They offer that promise of great pleasure and happiness if you just get a little bit more. They always assure you that at some point you're going to be contented. Paul talks about this in 1 Timothy 6, verse 9. We'll come back to 1 Timothy 6 a lot because he talks about this a lot here. But in verse 9, he says, "Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmless desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Talks about the idea, the desire to be rich, to have an overabundance, to have more than we need. Maybe even more than we can use at any given time. He doesn't say, by the way, that money is the root of all evil. Money's just a thing like anything else. It has no value apart from what we give it. And when we start valuing it in the things that it can buy in a way that we ought to be valuing things that are spiritual, that are eternal, that have real inherent value to them, we can see how destructive it can be in the lives of people around us and in the Lord's church even as well. Because when we think about covetousness, we almost talked about this in the class, and I kind of steered away from it because I wanted to make this point in the sermon. Covetousness is a gateway sin. It's why people steal. Why people are unfaithful to their wives. It's why in the Old Testament, even so many Jews would keep working on the Sabbath when God said to rest. Why did they keep violating the Sabbath? It's not because they just wanted to go out and sweat and work. It's because they made money when they worked. And I don't want to have a day when I miss out on the money that I could earn. even false witnesses in some cases. Why would we do that? Sometimes because we would covet some sort of social acceptance or a response from people we talk to. Maybe it makes me feel exalted in their eyes to be able to say something that may not really be true. Maybe they have some respect or standing that we don't have, and it makes us bitter, and we want to take that from them, so we say bad things about them that aren't true. How many times does covetous lead to hatred, and hatred on to murder? That the second great sin that we read about in the Bible. 1 John 3 talks about that in 1 John 3 verse 12. He says, we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. He coveted God's love. He wanted to be who Cain was, and rather than changing his behavior to be like Cain, he murdered his brother. Or to be like Abel, I should say. Murder sparked by jealousy. Which, by the way, maybe it's irony, but it's pretty closely related to covetousness. The word zealote, which is the word that we get zeal or jealousy. That's the same word that's used by James in James 4 that we translate covet. He says in James 4 verse 2, you desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet, you desire, you're jealous for things, you want things badly and cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. Remember this movie that came out years ago? Probably a lot of you may have even seen it. I won't name it, but because it's rated R, I'm not sure I can recommend it. But it's about a hunt for a serial killer, and the FBI agent goes to visit him, and a convicted killer in jail, to talk to him about how I can catch this guy. And he asks her this question. He says, what does this man do? And she says, he kills women. And the answer is no, that's incidental. What's the first principal thing he does? He covets. That is his nature. And how do we begin to covet? We begin by coveting what we see every. That's how they caught it. Every once in a while, Hollywood gets it right, even when they don't mean to. Sinful covetousness is about seeing what we don't have that is possessed by somebody else or controlled by somebody else, or maybe it is somebody else, and feeling motivated to go and take it by whatever means are necessary. Or if not acting, feeling a sense of deprivation or discontent, bitterness that someone else has something that I want, and frankly, that I deserve, at least in my view. Talked about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life. Aren't we all talking about covetousness and all of those? I see something I don't have that I know would bring me pleasure. I see something that would add beauty or joy to my life. If I just had it for myself, I see something that would make me more than I am today. Covetous ultimately is what leads us into all manner of sin. Maybe that's why it's taken so seriously in the Bible. A lot more seriously than we take it, frankly. Because we look at 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9. What does Paul say? He says, I wrote to you in my letter. He's talking about a man who has committed adultery by being in an adulterous relationship with his father's wife. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. And he goes on in verse 11, now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler. By the way, that word greed is a word that we typically will translate covetousness. No, not even to eat with such a one. I'll have to ask Jim and Ted after. Have you ever disfellowshed anybody for being covetous? I'm guessing the answer is no. I don't know of anybody who's ever done that. And maybe that's a question we ought to ask ourselves. At what point does someone's covetousness become so bad that we need to withdraw fellowship from somebody? What would that look like? What would it make someone so covetous that we would observe him and say, that person cannot be in our fellowship anymore? Because all of us probably would like to have more than we have, at least in some way. All of us have said, I'd like a little more. Is that wrong? At what point have I violated God's law so much that I need to be withdrawn from? That's a question that we ought to be asking ourselves. Because if Paul sees covetousness as so serious that we need to separate fellowship from someone because of it, then it's definitely enough to separate me from God. So I need to know what that is. And what makes this even harder is because we put that Andrew Tate example up, and we can really easily say, well, there you go. That's covetousness. I'm not that. I'm certainly not like all those people in the world who are constantly chasing money and power and fame. I don't need hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm not that person. I guess I'm sick. But really could use a new house. And a nicer car would be pretty great. And I don't need a dozen mansions, but maybe one would be great. And a few more vacation days. It just a little bit more, a little bit more. At what point does wanting become covetous? That's a hard question, but it's a question that we need to be asking ourselves. And maybe a sign to watch for is when our thinking goes from, yeah, it'd be pretty great if I had one of those things, to something like, my life would be so much better if I had more money. I just saw where so and so lived, and I can't believe their house is bigger than ours. Why can't we have something like that? Or wouldn't people? I bet I'd turn some heads in that car. What would people think if they saw me driving down the road in that? I stopped thinking about how God has blessed me in terms of how grateful I am and what I ought to be doing with those things to please God who gave them to me. And I started thinking about how I really need more than what God has given me, either to make my life easier, to look more impressive in the eyes of the others around us, to feel like I'm successful and happy and blessed, just like my neighbor or the person I know on Facebook that's always showing these great pictures of where he just went and how great a time he had and what wonderful food he ate, showing me what an amazing life he has. And I really want to live like he does. Do we ever start feeling that way? Our society is literally designed to inspire that kind of envy in us. Whether it's an envy that says, I want to aspire to have what these people have, or the anger that says, I hate that they have those things. And I hope it all burns down. We ever heard anybody that thought that? Maybe we felt like that sometimes. It even finds its way into spiritual thinking sometimes. I think I've said this before. Laura's getting probably sick of me hearing me say this. She knows what I'm going to say. We've seen that song. I've got a mansion over the hilltop. What am I going to do when I get to heaven? God, give me my gold mansion with silver lining. I want my mansion, my robe, and my crown. I want it right now. I always wonder, why do we think if we're leaving our sins on on the earth when we go up to heaven, why do we think we can bring covetousness in with us? I always wonder about that. That's another story. But it's but when we think about that, do we hear self-proclaimed preachers in the world trying to tell people that if you'll come to God, you'll get that gold mansion? You can have all those things. In fact, you don't have to wait till heaven. You can have them right now. If you'll just be a part of our church and you'll send us money and say prayers, God will send you even more material blessings than you have. He is going to bless you. So have we heard that? And people believe that. We've got I forget what her title is in the Trump administration, who teaches that very thing. And she's advising the president about spiritual matters. What does that tell you? Is that a problem? It's pretty amazing. And we even in different churches where we have financial services seminars where we can teach people how to use their money more wisely and build your portfolios and retire and maybe even get. When did that become the work of the church? When did that become the concern of the church? I think it's safe to say that our culture has infiltrated even the Lord's body sometimes. Possessions have become a lot more important to us than they probably should have. And now I'm talking to me. I want to make sure everybody understands this because this is a lesson I think that we all need to hear. Particularly when we read about Christians in the first century and how they viewed their property. People in Hebrews 10:34, where it says you had compassion on those in prison and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourself had a better possession and an abiding one. Could we do that? Think about the rich ruler. And we always make the point in the story of the rich ruler that Jesus didn't command all his disciples to sell everything they had to give to the poor and come home. That's true. Not all disciples did that. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus didn't do it. We know that, right? But I do wonder, would I do it if I had to? If it really came down to that. We'll probably never be in a position, I say, where we'll have to sell possessions to help brothers who are starving. But would I do it? I don't know the answer to that, but God does. That ought to make us feel a little sober about our lives, because God knows what I would do in that situation. That answer needs to be yes. That's exactly what I would do. Whatever I need to do to help my brothers, that's what I'm going to do. And it can't be about my possessions. So as I think about this, and how do we guard against this problem? Because I guarantee you, all of us, I talked about this a little bit. There's a sense in which probably all of us have violated the commandment to murder. We may have all violated the commandment to commit adultery in some way. We maybe well, I know we've all stolen in some way, in some manner. But I know that we've all coveted. And by us, I mean me. These are things we need to worry about. So how do I guard against that? I was just thinking about some things that we can remind ourselves or need to be thinking about really on an everyday basis. And the first one is obviously pretty clear. Is that everything I have is from God. That's where it needs to start. It's not truly mine. As much as I may have done in this life to earn a living and make good investments and make good choices, I'm only able to do that because God made that possible, using what God has allowed me to possess. So if my focus in this life is getting as much personal enjoyment out of what I have, I missed the point of why God gave this to me in the first place. In Luke 16:10, after the parable of the unrighteous judge or the unrighteous steward, Jesus says, "One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which you own, which is your own?" The way we manage our blessings in this life today has an impact on whether we're going to be given eternal blessings or not. Heaven, that ought to give us pause for a second. The idea that how I spend my money matters, even if what I'm doing is not inherently wrong. Is it wasteful? Is it undisciplined? Is it selfish in nature? Those are questions we ought to ask ourselves. And that leads us to the second reminder, which is that we've got to remember to put what we've been given to good spiritual use. As I mentioned earlier, God absolutely made us rich in this country by any reasonable historical standard. And the point of acknowledging that is not to make us feel guilty, not to make us feel bad about what we have. I always think about what Nathan told David after he'd been caught with Uriah. And he comes to him and says, "David, I gave you your master's house, your master's wives. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would have added to you as much more." Like, David, what do you want? What else do you want? What can I give you? Is this not enough? Here's more. That's how God blesses us. God is not sitting here going, "Well, I think you've got too much." But those blessings aren't just about our enjoyment, are they? There's a reason that God allows people to be wealthy in this life. It's because that wealth carries the expectation that it will be used for the good of others. Back in 1 Timothy 6, where he says in verse 17, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." There's that idea. He gives us these things to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. That's something I know I don't always do a good job of. I don't know a whole lot of people who are visibly or noticeably in need in our culture. We pretty much have to go looking for somebody to help sometimes. And maybe that's my problem, is maybe I just don't look hard enough sometimes. But even if it isn't charitable acts, I think part of this is simply just to be kind, to do good for each other. Even if it's not about saving somebody from starvation, it's just doing something nice for somebody. To find a way to bless our brothers and sisters in some way. Even it's 1 Peter 4:8 talks about the idea of loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's very grace. Am I looking for ways to serve my brethren with the blessings that God has given me? I ought to be thinking about that. Thirdly, we need to be actively practicing contentment. And that's a different, I didn't say be content. I said actively practicing contentment, but because I think there is a difference. because we all know we need to be content. Everybody knows it. And like we said, well, I am content. I don't need $10 million. I'm content with three or whatever it might be. We understand that concept in 1 Timothy 6, where he says that godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with all these we will be content. That word, by the way, for clothing is the Greek word that also can refer to housing. And so it seems like what Paul's basically saying: you got a roof over your head, you got clothes on your back, you got food on your table, you got what you need. And you should be grateful for that and content with that. And we all have that. I suspect that none of us are sitting here thinking, I really think I'd have more. I don't have enough. God just hadn't given me enough. I don't think that any of us believe that. But I wonder sometimes if we live in our everyday activities like that's true. And I'm talking again, I'm talking about myself. I'm trying to get better about this. Hopefully I am getting better. Because when we make these everyday decisions, I'm walking along and I see something and I think, that'd be really great. I got plenty of money. No reason why I can't buy it. And so I buy it. Nothing inherently wrong with doing that. But at the same time, I wonder if we ought to be practicing some restraint in that area, that it's not always about just because I can. Because it's easy to say that I'm content when I basically, anytime I see something I want, I just buy it. Okay, I'm content. I see something, I'm not content. I buy it. I'm content again. I don't know that that's necessarily what we're talking about here. Sometimes I think contentment needs to be about saying, I don't really need that. And maybe that money could be better used in some other way for someone that's truly needed, or maybe just to make sure that I've got it so that if Central Texas ever gets deluged again, then I'll be able to help. And maybe that's kind of what I'm thinking about a little bit. And again, I'm not telling anybody that you're wrong for buying. I'm not saying that it's wrong to impulse buy anything. Please don't misunderstand. But I am just saying that I think it's good for our contentment to tell ourselves no every once in a while. Maybe more often than we do. Not because we can't afford it, not because it's wrong to get it, just because I want to differentiate for myself between what I want and what I need. And I don't need this, so I'm not going to buy it today. We ought to be actively reminding ourselves of those distinctions. And in doing so, I think we can find reasons to rejoice and praise God for all he has given us, because he's given us so much. And I think that leads to the fourth point, which is to never stop being grateful to God and actively giving thanks for what we have. So easy to take for granted what God does for us every day, not just the possessions. The fact that we woke up today, the fact that we drove through a beautiful sunshiny day, through the beautiful trees and see the hills and the life, and we know that it's all going to happen again tomorrow, regardless of how much we screw this world up. God is going to continue to bless us in some ways that we can't even imagine. We need to be grateful people. They're reminding ourselves of those blessings every single day and celebrating those blessings every day. And not just our own, but the blessings that we see God giving others. And I think this is an important part of this. In Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice. And when a brother or sister who we know is blessed in some way, that'll thrill us as much as if it happened to myself. I'd be grateful for that too, because a big part of covetousness, of course, is that nagging sensation we get when something good happens to someone we know, and we think to ourselves, I could use that raise. Congratulations, but I kind of wish that had been me. Don Truex has told this story. I kind of borrowed some things from this series from him, and was listening to his lesson in this. And he told a story about a man who was telling him about what happened when he was a child. He said he remembered going down the street and seeing his best friend driving off on a brand new bike. And he told his mom, I wish I had that bike. Mom said, now, really ought to say is that you wish you had a bike just like that. I said, yeah, you're right. That's what I meant. And she paused a little bit and said, now, what you really, really ought to say is that you wish you had a bike just like his, and that he was able to get a better bike. That always stood with me. And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, that's kind of the point right there, and that's the hard part. Because it's no longer about me competing with you. I don't want to be equal with you. I don't need to be equal with you. I want you to have good things. that idea of the opposite idea of covetousness, which is not looking at myself and saying, I need to have what you have. It's like, I want you to, it's kind of like what we tell our kids. I want you to have a better life than I have. I want you to have better things than I have. I want to be able to go to your house and say, wow, this is fantastic. Congratulations. This is much better than I have. Good for you. And mean it. That's a lot harder for us. But isn't that how we're supposed to see each other in Christ? In Romans 12:10, where it says, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Really hard to be covetous towards a brother when I'm just glad that he has it. When I'd rather it be him than me because I want him to have good things. The world wants to create a climate in our lives where we're jealous of each other all the time. And when people are jealous of us, that's the sign that you've made it. I want to post those pictures on Facebook about our new car or our new house or how great our vacation was. And I hope everybody's just green with envy when they sees this. And every one of them going to say, I want what he has. Now I know that I succeeded. Now I feel fulfilled. Isn't that kind of how we do this in our lives? Isn't that what social media sometimes seems to be all about? And we start asking ourselves that question. We see these people, and maybe it's not us, and we say, "Well, I want what he has. I want his life." Social media never shows what that person had to give up to get that life. It never shows the strain on the family to earn enough money to go do those things. What they had to deny themselves to get all those things. There's this thing in economics. I know we're running out of time, so there's a thing called opportunity cost. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a real thing. It's when you plan on a project and you look at the money you're going to spend. You say, well, what could I do if I spent this money in another way? If I bought a new plant, it's going to cost us $1,000. It's going to bring in an additional $10,000 a year. But I could have invested this money and brought in an additional $15,000 a year. Which one am I going to do? Well, the investment. And if I choose the plant, I've cost myself $5,000. We see all the beautiful things and amazing experiences that people around us have, and we don't see what it costs. We have to ask ourselves, what's the spiritual cost of keeping up with the Joneses, as they say? We typically don't do that a lot. And because the last point is that we forget sometimes that we need to make sure that we're not evaluating our lives based on what other people have and who other people are. When Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 10, in verse 11 or verse 12, not that we dare to classify ourselves or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. It's one of the amazing stories in Luke 12. If you remember, Jesus is sitting down with the disciples and he's teaching. And he's talking about how they need to be ready in the face of difficulty and persecution to stand up and speak the truth. And it's going to be hard for you and all this stuff. And right in the middle of this, somebody stands up and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." I can't even imagine what was going through, what Jesus' expression was at this point. And stop everything to talk about greed. And he says, "Who made me a judge or an arbitrator over here?" And he tells a story about the rich fool, one whose solution to having too much was to build more, keep building and keep building, and at some point I'll have enough that I can sit back and be happy, because at some point my possessions will be enough for me. But what happens when we finally catch up with the Joneses? Are we going to have peace? Are we going to have peace? There'll always be someone with more. Keep resetting the bar and we go chase them. And at some point we lose sight of the fact that that's not why we're here. Envying people based on what they own will always lead us away from God. Which is why our eyes need to be focused on Jesus, on the goals that really matter, the goals that are given us in Christ, to aspire to something that's much better than what my neighbor has, which is eternal life, spiritual rewards in heaven. To hear Christ tell me, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your." What greater riches could we ever aspire? So that's our lesson. I apologize for going a little bit long, but as with all of these, there's so much we could say and so much I probably left out. The lesson is yours for your encouragement. And hopefully there's things that we can apply to our own lives. If there's anyone here this morning, you're subject to the invitation, need our prayers, need our encouragement, whatever it may be, please let us know as we stand, as we see our invitations.